Five, four, three, two, one. We are live. Coming to you live. Has this been live? Say what's up to the people, Dad.
Today, we are going to have another talk about history. And as we did last time, we're going to tie history to current developments. It's not just going to be history floating free, which is fine unto itself. Nothing wrong with telling great stories about history. But this, again, like our talk about voting, is very much tied into what's going on today when we talk about populism and whether Donald Trump really is a populist or has just been conning us for a decade about it.
Very interesting, Dad. Let's get into some current events. Let's see. Joe Biden pardoned a bunch of people. Kerry Lake became the head of Voice of America. The FBI director Christopher Wray says he's stepping down. Where do you want to start?
Let's start with the pardons. What is significant about these pardons is not who Biden pardoned, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but the number of pardons. He pardoned about 1,500 individuals. I think the previous record for one day of pardoning was about 330. So this is 4 to 5 times the volume of pardons. But unlike the pardon of his son, which remember we had a show talking about that. I was pretty critical of that, although you made the very good point. In the long run, it really amounts to little or nothing. But these were really solid pardons. Most of them were people who served their time and were at least having 1 year of home confinement. And according to reports, some of them were doing pretty good things, like helping people deal with natural disasters or participating in addict uh, counseling. So we're not talking about people who really pose a danger to society or likely have committed the most heinous kinds of crimes. This is the kind of thing that the pardon power was designed to do. And it doesn't come close to the worst pardons in history, the pardon of corrupt labor boss Jimmy Hoffa, which then was probably a silent quid pro quo because the Teamsters right after that endorsed Richard Nixon, who had pardoned Hoffa, contrary to the typical practice of endorsing Democrats. Of course, the pardon of Richard Nixon, the pardon of fugitive financier Mark Rich, Donald Trump's pardon of his cronies like Roger Stone and Paul Manafort, his pardon of private security employees convicted of mass murder in Iraq, far worse than anything that Biden has done with this round of pardons. I think, too, for good reason. And you know where we stood on this at the time. I think Biden is still very resentful of Democrats who forced him out of the race, openly and viciously trashed him right out in public, and all of it to no end. Democrats had a horrendous loss anyway, and who knows, if they'd listened to us and Biden had stayed in, we'll never know, but it could have been a different outcome. It certainly couldn't have been much worse. And I also think what Biden is trying to do is exercise as much of his presidential powers as he can in the last month and a half or so of his presidency prior to Donald Trump taking over on January 20th, 2025. And we're also seeing that in Biden attempting to get as many judges approved as possible while he's still president and the Democrats have a majority in the Senate. He wants to leave as few vacancies as possible for Donald Trump to fill. He also has threatened to veto if there is a congressional bill to expand the judiciary by some 66 additional positions. He doesn't want to open up those positions to be appointed by Donald Trump. Another uh, event in my mind is the appointment. It's not final. She's got to go through a lot of hoops of Kerry Lake as head of the Voice of America. Voice of America is very important. It may be not the most prominent of all federal agencies, but it's critical. It is, as the title says, America's voice around the world. And it is renowned for providing accurate, factual, independent, unbiased information to counter the propaganda issued by nations like China and the Russian Federation. It has some 350 million listeners and viewers around the world. And Kerry Lake is nothing but an absolute partisan, total supporter of Donald Trump. She lost two elections in Arizona. She wouldn't even concede the first election that she lost in 2022, even though she loses innumerable court cases. Her claims are as bogus as Trump's claim that he really won the 2020 election. And she is very much tied to Christian nationalist groups. So the real danger is that under Lake, the Voice of America will lose its independence, will lose its commitment to truth, and become nothing more than a propaganda arm of the Trump administration, just as broadcasts out of Russia are nothing more than a propaganda arm of the Putin regime.
You know what I find funny is that, especially online, you hear a lot of people on the right talking about the mainstream media, MSDNC, the Clinton News Network, and the right has their media ties. They're hiring people from Fox News straight into the administration. They're putting people like Kerry Lake into massive media roles. And then they never get any flack for it. I don't get where Americans' heads are at. It's always like the Democrats are so tied to the corporate media. Meanwhile, Trump is making Fox News panelists the most powerful people in the world, and nobody seems to be blinking an eye.
Yes, and I just, you heard me, I know you don't like me to talk about this, but I'm going to a little bit
Stop saying that. It's
disinformation.
not that I don't like you talking
I
about
know,
it.
I know. I'm going to spend just 1 minute on it because I just read two studies which said that disinformation was vastly greater in this election than any other election, which I said right after the election. And overwhelmingly, the study showed that disinformation favored Trump and disfavored Harris. And yet the right is constantly complaining about the biased media, manipulating the American people. In fact, it's just the opposite. 370 news sites, according to this study, disseminated disinformation. 370 sites. And over 20% of the disinformation came from foreign sources, over 90% of it Russian, the rest Iranian, and overwhelmingly favoring Trump and disfavoring Harris. And of course, Trump's own appointee to head the FBI is supposed to have a 10-year term to keep the FBI out of politics, just resigned. Christopher Wray, a Republican,
That's a big
but,
uh-oh, right?
right, Trump appointee who didn't run the FBI as an offshoot of the Republican Party, just resigned to be determined finally at the end of the Biden term, the beginning of the Trump term. He did that obviously because he didn't want to be fired. Trump has uh, appointed Kash Patel, you know, uh, like Kerry Lake, an undying loyalist to Trump, who has threatened to turn the FBI into an instrument of partisan revenge and partisan opportunism. So I'm not surprised Ray would resign. It's not good enough for Trump just to have a Republican in. He's got to have a loyalist in who's more loyal to Trump than to the Constitution or the country.
So this means that Patel is most likely going to be our next FBI director, do you think?
Yes, look, Republicans have made a lot of noise about a number of these appointees. And remember, I predicted Gates was a feint and that Trump would appoint someone very much along Gates's lines, but without Gates's baggage. which is exactly what he did with Pam Bondi. But we've heard a lot of noise about Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., Pete Hegseth, uh, Kash Patel. But we know what Republicans do in the end. What do they do when push comes to shove, Sam?
Give Donald Trump the thumbs up.
They cave in to Donald Trump, and I expect that's exactly what's going to happen. Maybe not with every one of his appointees, but with almost every one of his appointees. Remember my one sentence maxim about American politics. Uh, Republicans have no principles, Democrats have no spine. Interestingly, Biden today mused about another example of how horrible the Democrats are at messaging and how little courage they had. When you had a stimulus package under Trump, who signed the checks?
The Treasury?
Nope, Donald J. Trump
Oh,
signed the
right,
check.
right, right.
Biden never did. And so people didn't realize that these checks were due to initiatives of the Biden administration. So they know almost nothing about what Biden has done. And again, oh, I'm not going to do that because I'm afraid I'll be too political. Just like Merrick Garland sat on his rear for almost 2 years before launching an investigation at Trump. Oh my God, I might look like I'm being political, as if Republicans could care about what Democrats do. Republicans are going to do what they're going to do no matter what. And I cannot believe Democrats haven't learned that lesson yet.
And it seems like Hegseth is still floating around too. He's still. I saw today that he was meeting with John Fetterman, and he might get a. It looks like he's going in too.
Looks like he's going in. So we're going to have a drunk and a sex harasser. Great. You know, who has no experience running anything. You know, he was an ordinary soldier. I commend him for his service, but that doesn't qualify you to run, $1 trillion operation. And he was a Fox News commentator. It's just frightening, the kind of people that Trump has appointed, but not surprising. We predicted it all on this show. All right,
All right.
time to talk a little bit about history and
Yes.
how history ties in to our current predicament.
Do you remember what we call these, Dad?
What's that?
Do you remember what we call this section of our show?
What do we call it?
The Lichtman Lectures.
The Lichtman Lectures,
Hmm.
or History Today. So, who's the biggest con man in the history of the country, Sam? By far. And it's broadly recognized, not controversial.
Nixon.
No, not
Okay,
even
wait.
close.
Let me think. The
Come
biggest.
I'm
on.
having trouble hearing. Can you say that again?
Was that Alexa?
I don't know. Donald Trump, of course. Come on.
Oh.
By
Sorry, I
far,
didn't
it's
know
not
that.
close. But what people haven't glommed onto is the biggest con of all, bigger than Trump sneakers or Trump Bibles or Trump playing cards or, Trump University, Trump Institute, by far. And that is the idea that Trump is a populist. He's conned almost every journalist. He's conned a lot of academics into thinking that Trump represents populism. But when you look at the history of what populism actually represents, Trump is the very opposite of a populist. In fact, he would be a target of the populace. He represents, in fact, almost everything that historically the populists have been against. So Trump has turned history 180 degrees on its head to claim he represents something when he represents 180 degrees of difference. Do you know when the populist movement began, Sam?
Of course I know. Yes, of
Of course you
course.
do.
Yes. In 1918.
No, you're already wrong.
Ugh.
Late 19th century. And it was a movement primarily of ordinary farmers and to some extent ordinary workers, but mostly agricultural at a time when America was an overwhelmingly agricultural society. And people don't realize the late 19th century was a time of great deflation, not inflation. And for farmers, deflation was actually far worse than inflation because it meant that the prices that they would get for their farm goods were declining. So what they had to do was borrow money, right, to cover the cost of their operations because they weren't making enough to cover it. That put them in debt. So when you're in debt and the economy is deflationary, you are paying back your debts in higher dollars than you borrowed them in the first place because dollars are buying less than they were when you borrowed the money. So farmers, particularly in the Great Plains states, were suffering. They were facing foreclosure. They were facing debts that they couldn't pay. They were facing, hard times in feeding their family. And so, unlike the Trump movement, which is very much a top-down movement, beginning with Trump and his cronies, the populist movement was a bottom-up movement of ordinary farmers and also miners in the mountain states to try to deal with the plight of economic hardship, deflation. The other thing that farmers felt that they were facing and they had to deal with was that they were being gouged by the railroads that transported their goods, by the corporations that stored their goods, and by the communications company upon which they also relied. So there was no, national historical figure who began and organized and inspired the populist movement. It really came from the ground up. It was organized locally. And in 1892, it actually became an organized political party, one of the many third parties that have grown up in the United States. And it ran actually a fairly obscure candidate, James B. Weaver, not, a major national figure, as its presidential candidate. And as third parties go, it did pretty well, getting 8.5% of the popular vote. No third party candidate in the last 40 to 50 years, except for Perot, has, really topped that level. And the platform of the Populist Party was exactly the opposite of what Donald Trump represents and what Donald Trump tried to do in his first term and promises to do in his second term, which is big tax cuts for the wealthy and the corporations, deregulation of businesses so businesses could operate without having to worry about running contra to the interests of ordinary Americans or the interests of the country. The populist platform was exactly the opposite of that. It targeted rich people like Donald Trump and his supporter, Elon Musk, the $350 billion guy who's richer than most countries of the world. Those were the kind of people, not that rich, but the rich at the time who bitterly opposed the populists. Of course, what the populists wanted to do, among many other things, was a graduated income tax. We didn't actually get a graduated income tax until the early 20th century. That was a pretty radical idea at the time, and you could imagine how powerfully it was opposed by the wealthy, who would, be the ones most burdened to pay a graduated income tax. Exactly the opposite of the kind of tax cuts that Donald Trump is proposing. They were against tariff protection for industry. Exactly the opposite of what of the kinds of tariffs that Donald Trump had imposed and promises to impose in an even more draconian way in a second administration. Rather than deregulating business, not only did they propose regulating business, they proposed public ownership of business. They proposed public ownership of the railroads, really the premier industry of their time. They proposed public ownership of the telegraph and telephone industries. They proposed that the federal government should set up postal savings banks so they wouldn't have to put their money in banks controlled by the big financial interests that they were opposed to. And they also proposed inflation. They wanted to expand the supply of the money to increase prices at a time of deflation. And their main demand was so-called free coinage of silver because the money supply was constricted. Farmers had to pay premium dollars on their loans, and it was constricted because the US was tied to gold. So you couldn't really expand the supply of money beyond the supply of gold, and that greatly restricted the money supply. So they proposed the monetization of silver, and there was huge amounts of silver being discovered. So if you tied the money supply not just to gold, but also to silver, you would greatly expand the money supply, hopefully reduce interest rates, and increase the prices of the goods that the farmers were selling. They proposed a ratio of 16 to 1, 16 ounces of silver monetized to every ounce of gold monetized because silver was that much less valuable than gold. They also proposed restricting land ownership by big corporations. So this is kind of the opposite of what Donald Trump stands for. Big tax cuts, deregulation, appointing pro-business appointees to all of the critical federal agencies, imposing new tariffs. Just the opposite of everything that Donald Trump stands for. And of course, their support was down truly in the grassroots. You didn't have the wealthiest people like Elon Musk and the Koch brothers. I guess it's now just one of them, Harlan Crow, the Mellons, the wealthiest people in America. They're all opposed to the populists. I just checked out in 2024 the top 10 richest donors, and by an enormous margin, they gave vastly more money to Republicans than to Democrats in 2024. That would be true even not counting the $250 million, a quarter of $1 billion that Elon Musk spent to help elect Donald Trump. Now, it is true that there was some xenophobia in the populist movement. They were worried about aliens owning land and competing with them, absolutely, and that was completely common at the time. But generally, as Walter Nugent pointed out in his wonderful book, The Tolerant Populace, they were more tolerant than most Americans of the late 19th century when it came to women and minorities. There were important women involved in the populist movement. Now, just like all third-party movements, the populist movement really had no chance to compete with the major parties. So in 1896, the next presidential election, the People's Party, for the most part, fused with the Democratic Party and united behind a Democratic populist, the first Democratic populist in history. Do you know who the Democratic candidate was in 1896, Sam?
The Democratic candidate in 1896 was James K. Polk.
That was 1844. You're only off by about 50 years or so.
Damn.
William Jennings Bryan.
Brian. See, I did know. I did. I
You
said
did know.
Brian.
Came
Yeah.
out of nowhere. Obscure congressman from Nebraska. Very difficult to go from Congress, not the Senate, to become a presidential nominee. Essentially never happens. And he became famous for one of the most influential speeches in all of American history. You know what that speech was?
Oh, God, I'm doing so bad tonight, and I'm actually paying attention because we've got so
All
many.
right, never mind.
Let me think. Let me think. Let me
All
think.
right.
Give me a second, man.
1896, William Jennings Bryan convention speech that is memorialized today as one of the great speeches in all of American history.
The Cowardly Lion. Is that what
Nope.
it's called? Damn it.
The Cross of Gold speech.
Oh, the Cross of Gold.
Yes. An epitomal populist speech. He was a Democrat, but he also very much followed these anti, you know, uh, big business ideals of the populist party. And he became the first populist Democrats. And his speech, the Cross of Gold speech, was in favor of the expansion of the money supply to help farmers by monetizing silver. And it was called the Cross of Gold speech. And his
Not the
battle cry
not the
was
cowardly lion speech.
not the cowardly.
Somebody wrote cowardly lion. I don't know if they're in the chat. I don't know if they were talking
I
about
don't
something
know.
else, but I just read it. So
You're
apologies.
too easily swayed. He said, "We will not let America be crucified on a cross of gold." In other words, that we would not allow ordinary Americans to suffer because we've limited the money supply by hewing to the gold standard. And he strongly advocated uh, the monetization of silver at 16 to 1, the critical plank of the populace, as well as other populist uh, ideas. He lost to William McKinley, conservative Republican in 1896. He ran twice more, ran against McKinley again in 1900, lost again. A very consequential election because, as we know, McKinley was assassinated right at the beginning of his term. And who became president when McKinley was killed, Sam? Very famous. Big name.
When McKinley got killed, Teddy Roosevelt became president.
Yes, you nailed
Finally,
it.
finally
Exactly.
tonight.
And he lost again, three-time loser. Very rare. Only Henry Clay kind of matched that, uh, losing to William Howard Taft in 1908. But the fusion of populism in the Democratic Party and the nomination of William Jennings Bryan completely transformed American politics and really laid the foundation for a complete switch around of the two parties in the 20th century. That prior to Bryan's campaign, it was the Republicans who were really the party of activist government, the party of Lincoln. And it was the Democrats under Grover Cleveland and Andrew Jackson who were the party of limited government, hard money, and states' rights. That began to completely change as Bryan adopted many populist ideas and the business community lined up behind Republicans, foreshadowing the more activist 20th century Democratic Party and the more pro business Republican Party. And so the populist movement, which truly represented the interests of ordinary Americans, even though it didn't succeed in gaining power, still had a transforming effect on the politics of America and is exactly the opposite of what Trump and his supporters stand for. Trump and Elon Musk and Harlan Crow and the Mellons and that whole crowd are exactly the kind of quote unquote elites that the populists were campaigning against and wanted to control. And so I think the biggest con that America's greatest con has perpetrated on us is the idea that he represents populism, the heritage of the populist movement in the United States, when in fact what he stands for and what he represents is exactly what populists were against and were trying to combat.
Wow, I learned a lot during that, Dad. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I didn't even realize that populists had their own party at one point. I thought it was just a ideological thing.
No, it was very well organized. And as I said, getting north of 8% of the vote is pretty good for a third party movement. But of course, no third party has really ever established itself as an alternative to the two major parties. Uh, the only sort of third party that emerged, but it was very different, was the Republicans, but that was after one of the two major parties disintegrated in the 1850s. Do you know which party disintegrated in the 1850s,
The
Sam?
Whigs.
You got it. Wow, you're nailing it tonight. And so it wasn't like a third party emerged to challenge the two major parties. It was a third party emerged to fill a vacuum left behind by the disintegration of one of the two major parties. But the populists, were incredibly radical, even for today, talking about ownership of the railroads and, controlling the banks and owning the communications capabilities of the country. That's radical stuff, just the opposite of the deregulation and anything goes for business that Trump wants to adopt.
Why do you think so many people see him as a populist then? I mean, are they just all being conned? I mean, I even see some people on the left saying that he's a form of a populist. Why are so many people think of him like that?
One, because he rails against the so-called elites, you know, the universities, the media, things like that, which makes him look like, oh, populism represents anti-elitism, and I'm against the elite. And of course, as we know, uh, the real elite in this country are the big corporations and the billionaires. They're the ones who have power and influence. And do you think for a moment the interests of Elon Musk are the same as the interests of ordinary Americans? This is a guy who said,
No,
if
of
my
course
workers
not.
strike, I want to fire them.
Right.
And he wants to cut back on critical programs that are the mainstay of ordinary Americans, like Social Security. And, what did Trump try to repeal and fail only because of John McCain in his first term?
The Affordable Care Act.
Yeah, 20 million Americans got their insurance, ordinary Americans who couldn't otherwise afford it because of the Affordable Care Act. 20 million Americans. Tens of million Americans are for the first time protected from existing conditions. Uh, Young people can stay on their insurance of their parents till 26. This is one of the biggest boons to ordinary average Americans in the modern history of the country. And Trump, the populist, supposedly wants to get rid of it. And what does he have to
Yeah.
replace it, Sam?
Uh, what did he say? Concepts of an idea.
Concepts.
Yeah. Or something like that.
It's
Yeah.
had 10 years to develop a plan and only has this concept. So, it's really important to cut through the BS and the rhetoric and understand in a hard way what kinds of interests Trump and his supporters represent and how opposite it is to what American populism has stood for.
But there is no doubt that Trump, especially with white working class voters, does very well. So is this like a twisted form of populism? Is this some sort of like combination of corporate populism? Do we need a new term for this?
It's very difficult to understand why he does so well with mostly with non-college educated people. And there was a study of his 2016 campaign, and it said it wasn't so much cultural issues. It was, excuse me, economic issues. It was cultural resentments that Trump was stirring up. That somehow he's convinced these people who kind of feel left out, who feel the culture is bypassing them, that Trump represents their champion. But, these people understood he wasn't during his first term. 41% average approval rating during his first term. 41%, right at the bottom historically of all presidents. People weren't fooled. And yet somehow, and I haven't wrapped my head around this, they somehow, 4 years later, thought Trump was this great president who was doing all these wonderful things for them. Very, very hard to understand.
Do you think maybe he's just a right wing populist?
That has no meaning to me.
Right.
Populism is not right wing. Fascism, might be a kind of right wing populism, but in terms of what populism historically actually represents, the term right-wing populism is an oxymoron, although you see it used all the time when it comes to Trump. And it's highly inaccurate.
Right, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, I think we're all trying to wrap our minds around, what does Trump represent? How is he able to connect to 70 plus million voters? Everybody on the right says that we're just out of touch, but I don't think that's the truth. I don't know what's happening, but I don't think they know what's happening either, really.
And already Trump is saying, I'm not going to reduce your grocery prices. Forget what I promised during the campaign. He said today, don't expect your grocery prices to go down. Of course not. There's only one way you get prices to go down. And what's that, Sam?
There's only one way for prices to go
Actually
down:
have deflation, prices going down. What do you have to push the economy into?
a recession.
A recession. Exactly. That's deflation, a recession. Otherwise, there's no way to have prices come down. You can reduce inflation, and that's exactly what Biden did from 9 plus to somewhere between 2 and 3%. But again, because of the disinformation, the vast majority of Trump voters believed inflation is going up rather than going down because prices are still going up as they always do, except when you're in a recession.
Yeah. Well, that was very interesting. Let's go to our Q&A section, Dad. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, and you have your housekeeping things.
I have my housekeeping things. If you're watching live on YouTube, give the stream a like. We only got 430 likes, 1,400 people currently watching. So throw the stream a like. Don't forget to subscribe. Follow us on social media. And guess what, Dad? Lichtman Live is now on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you like listening in the car, if you like listening in the shower, if you like listening on walks, you want the audio version, it's on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
And we need members and super chats, right?
Our members and our super chats get priority in this Q&A section. So if you want to have a chance for the distinguished professor of history, Allan Lichtman, to answer your question, you got to become a member or you got to donate. All right, let's get to it. Our first question. Oh, I also want to give a shout out to our mods. We've got a lot of great mods working the channel now. Anthony, Sam M, Jeff, Sean, Savannah. Shout out to them. Thank you for your hard work. Our first question is from a member, PVKip999. They say, should Democrats take on the role of populist beliefs and make it a strength for voters to take back the White House in 2028 to stop all of Trump's policies? I mean, I know
100%. That's an incredibly smart comment. Remember what I've said, Democrats are horrible at messaging. People don't know what Democrats really stand for, and they certainly don't know all of the accomplishments of the Biden administration. They think Biden just sat around and did nothing when in fact he had more domestic accomplishments than any American president since the 1960s. I really do think a genuine populist message would resonate with the American people and offer a real challenge to what Donald Trump stands for. I think that's a very, very smart comment.
Chris Murphy said that Democrats must embrace left-wing economic populism and be culturally moderate. Who do you think would fit that? This viewer thinks
Andy
John.
Bashir,
Ah,
the
your
guy I've
man.
been touting all along. I'm not sure what being culturally moderate means because I don't think Democrats should abandon their support for civil rights, voting rights, protections for transgender and LGBTQ peoples. But I absolutely think, the economic message should be at the forefront.
Josh Shapiro should be the 28 nominee because he is really well liked governor. Plus, Pennsylvania is a swing state. What do you think?
I've always liked Josh Shapiro, as you know. He was my first choice for Kamala Harris's vice president. I don't know because I haven't seen him enough. We're not from Pennsylvania to know if he has what it takes to be a presidential candidate, though. You never know how someone is going to fare until they're exposed to the white heat of a presidential nomination campaign. Lots of candidates have wilted under that white heat. Look what
Wow.
happened to all the contenders against Trump in 2016, like Jeb Bush or Governor Kasich or Ted Cruz, who were way, way highly touted above Trump until they had to face the Republican primary electorate.
JB Brown says if a state joins the reform legislation for the Electoral College, hypothetically in the last election, would that have meant that Hawaii's 2 electoral votes goes to the national popular winner, i.e. Trump, or the state's popular winner, Harris? Just checking. Someone said they go to the national popular winner, and that seems wrong.
It's my understanding too that this cross-state voter compact says that your electoral votes go to the winner of the popular vote.
Thank you for that, Dad. I appreciate you clearing that up. And so does JB Brown, I bet.
I bet. Always keep in mind, I'm not a lawyer when I give you the interpretation of the laws, but I am, I have studied these things for a while. I think I'm pretty old.
You think you're pretty old?
I'm not sure. I
Interesting.
feel like I'm 27.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Zoe K. Lynch says, how can Democratic governors or Dem governors protect constituents in their respective states from the anticipated challenges under the Trump administration?
It's going to be extremely difficult. What they're going to have to do is not cooperate with the more extreme measures of Donald Trump. For example, his effort to deport 11 to 12 million undocumented immigrants who are the mainstay of the agricultural, construction, hospitality, and personal service industries. They need to declare their states sanctuary states that protect undocumented immigrants from encroachment, and they need to strengthen it as much as they can. They don't all have compatible legislatures. All of their laws regarding the protection of the right to vote and the protection of the civil and rights and liberties of all peoples within their jurisdictions.
Do you think?
Oh, one other thing,
Oh,
mobilize, you know, be politically active, do what, Democrats have not been good at doing. You're not just a policymaker as a governor or another state official, you're a party builder and work on building your party and organizing the voters.
do you think the old guards of the Democratic establishment, like Nancy Pelosi, Jim Clyburn, and Obama, have been discredited?
Yeah,
You do?
yeah, indeed. I mean, you look, I'm not Johnny come lately on this, right, Sam? Right at the time, who was bashing Pelosi and company for viciously trashing their elected president and elected nominee and trying to push him out?
Allan Schlichtman.
Yes, I mean, and I took a lot of heat for that, but I think I was right. And to this day, they've not owned up to their complicity. They haven't looked in the mirror. Instead, they blamed everybody else. So yeah, I agree with that.
Do you think Democrats should open their own version of the Daily Wire? The Dems are losing the info war.
100% yes. I think I've talked about this before, but it's so important. I need to reiterate it. Democrats are spending way too much money on political ads, which I don't think move anyone. What they need to be spending their money, time, and effort on is greatly expanding their means of communicating with the American people, which right now is overwhelmingly dominated by Republicans and conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that, but I also fear that we're just going to move ourselves into a media landscape that is so polarized and so partisan that it's not actually beneficial to the American people.
That is a huge problem, but you can't just concede it. You got to fight it.
Yeah, I hear you.
And I don't mean fighting it with counter lies. I mean fighting it with counter truth. I always turn back to what Adlai Stevenson, you know who he was, Sam?
Adlai Stevenson, I do not.
He was the governor of Illinois who ran against Eisenhower unsuccessfully in 1952 and 1956. Very witty guy, very smart guy, not the greatest politician. And one of his great lines was, if my opponents will stop telling lies about me, I promise to stop telling the truth about them.
Damn, got him.
Fight
Got
it
him.
with truth, not other lies.
True. You ain't wrong. All right. What do you think of these preemptive pardons? Will they help make things worse or do nothing? Would it keep them out of prison?
Well, they won't do nothing. They will keep people out of prison. I have, I've talked about this before. I have mixed feelings about it, but it would be a bold move by a Democratic Party that's lacking in bold moves and, will provide some comfort and freedom to those who are preemptively pardoned. And the president has perfect power to preemptively pardon anyone he wants.
We're going to go to one of our Discord questions, Dad. If you're interested in joining our Discord, you can do so in the description of this video. We also have a Reddit. Right, Dad? That's cool, too.
Whatever you say, I'm not sure what all these things are, but I don't need to know.
Do you know what Reddit is?
Yeah, it's a platform for people to express their ideas.
You're not wrong. You're not
Okay.
wrong.
See, I'm not just an old dinosaur. I'm at least caught up to the 20th century, maybe not the 21st century.
Correct. Madison Beer says, what predictive use do the keys have if it turns out that, I'm not even sure how to say this word, axiological statements about how, quote, good a government performs is not grounded by any stance independent facts about good governance?
Oh, you've heard me talk about this forever, and I always refer you to Orwell's 1984 and to the writings of the late great social philosopher Hannah Arendt, that the foundation of democracy is truth. And the first thing that authoritarians do is destroy truth and replace it with self-serving lies. And it works. I'm not blaming the voters. People are not fact checkers. And the big lie works. If you say it loudly enough and often enough, people come to believe it. And as you and I have talked about a lot, you can throw out a lie in half a sentence. The migrants are out to kill you. And then I've got to cite statistics and studies and analyses to refute that. That's why the old saying is a lie travels around the world before truth gets its shoes on.
Krasimir Boyanov says, as much as we want to push a female president, I think it's way too advanced for the average American. Professor, what is your opinion on the topic?
What's way too advanced?
A female president. I guess this person is saying that the American people
I'm
are
not
not.
pushing that. I want the best possible candidate, regardless of race, religion, gender. But I do think, there was a lot of misogyny in this campaign. I'm not saying misogyny was what won for Trump. You've heard me talk about it before. It's a lot more involved, but I do think there are special challenges for a woman candidate, not just among men, but there are a lot of women who don't believe women should be leading the country and should be subordinate to men. The largest Protestant denomination, the biggest one, Southern Baptist Convention, won't even allow women to be pastors, much less presidents of the United States.
Diane Kastner says, I just saw Charlie Angus from Canada. It seems like they're struggling with the conservatives just like the U.S. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, these struggles are going on all over the world. There has been a resurgence. I wouldn't even call it conservatism, I'll call it authoritarianism. The Economist has this tracker of democracy. And sadly, what their 21st century tracker shows is a precipitous decline worldwide in fully functioning democracies, to the point where only a small minority of people are today in a fully functioning democracy.
Sean Matthews says, what role did Condoleezza Rice play in shaping the U.S. policy towards Iraq? And how did her justifications for the Iraq War reflect the broader goals and challenges of the Bush administration at the time? Wow, that's
Very
quite a
good point.
question.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'll devote a whole lecture to the Iraq War. I think I will, but I'll just give a very superficial, very quick answer. Condoleezza Rice was very much complicit, although not the primary moving force in the invasion of Iraq, which had nothing to do with combating terrorism. Saddam Hussein was a head of the Ba'ath Party, a secular party. He hated the extreme Islamicists like Al Qaeda. It had everything to do with this kind of neoconservative vision of somehow reshaping and reordering in America's interests the entire Middle East. Of course, it was a monumental failure, and Condoleezza Rice was certainly part of it, although not, again, the primary figure behind it.
Jack Powell says, no question, just a comment. I absolutely love the lectures, Dr. Lichtman. It's such an invaluable resource to get history lessons from a long tenured professor of such a great university. Thanks to both of you. Well, thank you,
Thank
Jack.
you. I will say great university. I don't like emphasizing the long, but you got to live with that.
Correct, sir. Holden Brewer says, which of your books should be on my Christmas list, specifically to dissect the future Trump administration 2.0?
Absolutely 13 cracks, repairing American democracy after Trump. It really anticipated the events of today 3 years ago.
Is your new book, The Truth About Conservatives, going to be an updated version of your White Protestant Nation book?
To an extent, yes, but it's going to be a more of a pointed book. That book was pretty much straight history. This will also be a commentary on current affairs as well, which was somewhat part of White Protestant Nation, but a little bit more so in this book. But it also clearly is an update of my 2008 book. A lot has happened since then.
I am not a cat donated $10. They say, isn't it possible Trump's con will at some point wear thin and his supporters turn against him? Why does everyone always assume he won't fall from grace? Haven't other authoritarian leaders fallen?
I do not assume he won't fall from grace. I think he may well, but I think we need to understand, and this was the point of both my forthcoming book and my 2020 book, 13 Cracks. It's not just Trump now, it's the whole movement that Trump represents. If Trump was to blip out tomorrow, not a whole lot would change.
And I think the thing about Trump is he's gotten a lot further and gained a lot more power than anybody ever thought he would.
He has more power now than any political figure by far in the history of the United States
Really?
because he has control over every branch of government, the presidency, the Senate, the Congress, and a very sympathetic Supreme Court. And he is protected now by this unique doctrine of nearly universal presidential immunity, where he can do anything he wants under the color of official acts and not be held accountable for it.
That's a good point. I was about to rebuke you a little bit when you said, he has the Congress, he has all branch, plenty of presidents have had that, but you're right. The Supreme Court ruling about immunity really changed everything.
Yeah. And plenty of presidents have not had the Senate, the House, and the Supreme Court so much, and so much of the Supreme Court in their camp. That's very rare.
Right. I get what you're saying. People don't usually think about the Supreme Court in those terms, but it matters,
Right.
right? Do you think MAGA can take the U.S. into a political and constitutional crisis? I feel Trump wants to do anything to declare martial law in the U.S. so he can have more power, something similar to what President Yoon did in South Korea.
Absolutely. I think Trump is, you never know what Trump's going to do. He changes every 10 seconds, but I've warned everyone. I've been, on this theme for years. You got to take seriously what he says. You can't dismiss it as jokes, as hyperbole, as just political rhetoric. I think a lot of it is real. But the problem is because, as we just said, he controls all the levers of government. Uh, what's the check of his, trampling on the Constitution or on the laws of the land or even our democratic traditions? It's very scary.
Our second Discord question of the night jumps on what we were just talking about. Adamant says, after what transpired in South Korea, should countries do something about martial law? Should these countries find a better solution than using martial law?
Absolutely. I think martial law, should only be an absolute last result when the republic is in peril of perishing. It cannot be a routine measure for a president to impose his will on the country, but Trump has very broad powers to impose martial law under the Insurrection Act. And is this Supreme Court going to stop him? Maybe, but it's by no means certain.
What if I declare martial law against you, Dad?
But I have nothing, so it doesn't matter.
You have a cool tie on right now. I could take
Oh,
that.
yeah. But my cool ties are solely due to your beautiful, brilliant, athletic mom.
What are you drinking? What are you sipping on tonight? Diet Pepsi.
Oh, no.
I much rather support Dr. Brown than Diet Pepsi, to be
Yeah,
honest.
well, I got that too. I just finished it.
Oh, you're double fisting, huh?
I'm double fisted.
What? Okay.
Wow.
Double fisting. You're not double
Oh,
fisted.
double fisting. All right.
Yeah. Do you know what that means?
Not exactly, but I don't want to know.
Just means
I
you
have an
got
idea.
just means you got
Yes,
two tanks
I
in your
have an
hands.
idea.
Double fisted. That's something totally different.
Yeah. Well, you're a boxer, right?
I am a boxer. Yes.
Yeah.
That's more. No, you never use you never use a term like double fisted or fisting in Boston because you never punch twice at once.
I had a boxing match once when I was a teenager.
Okay.
And he decided, why would anyone do this? Why do you want to be hit in the face? I decided I didn't, and instead I became a college wrestler and never boxed again.
There's a certain art that comes with boxing and martial arts that, yeah, I mean, getting hit in the head is not good. There's no doubt about
No, I
that.
didn't like it. I
Yeah.
saw no value in it, but I'm sure lots of people do and are much more artful at it than I ever was.
Let's see. Let's see you give a 1-2 real quick. That's pretty good.
Not bad.
That was pretty good. It looked fast on camera. I think there was a little bit of a
I'm
glitch, but
fast. Hey, I'm competing in track in the Senior Olympics along with a bunch of other old farts.
right. All right, we'll get to two more questions for the night on Lichtman Live. The good news is, Dad, guess what? Guess what the good news is?
You're going to have your after show.
The Lichtman Live post show is coming up right after this. And I think, Dad, I'm going to try to take callers for the first time on my post show.
Wow.
So if you want to call in, make sure you join the Lichtman Live post show.
We do a quick poll before we,
Yeah, sure.
right? Should we invite guests?
Okay.
Or at least try to invite guests. It's not, let's say try to invite guests because no guarantee we can do
Should
it.
we try to invite guests on Lichtman Live?
Yes
Okay.
or no.
Yes or no? All right.
So we're going to take two more questions
Two more questions, sir. This
and then
question
we'll
is
check the poll.
this question is from CD. They said there's a great quote from a working class union guy who said in reference to Trump, I never thought I'd see the day so many of my fellow working class bros would kiss up to so much to the boss's son.
It's amazing, isn't it? 45% of union households voted for Trump. That's astonishing.
Yeah. I think I've talked about this before, but I also think that, I obviously thought Kamala lost because death by 1,000 cuts, but one of those big cuts was losing the support of union endorsements. I think that really hurt the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because I think the unions either didn't endorse anybody or some endorsed Trump
Yeah,
right
mostly
out.
didn't endorse anyone.
Right. But I think that hurt the Democrats a lot.
Yeah, I mean, the base of the Republican Party is the evangelical Christian churches. historically the base of the Democratic Party is the unions, and only 55% of union households voted Democratic. 88% of born again white evangelicals voted for Trump.
Our final question is from Philip H. A bit of a off-topic question, but hey, I'll throw it to you, see what happens. Have you seen the stories of drones in New Jersey, California, and frankly around the world? What do you think they are?
I have no idea, but it's very frightening. You know, we're almost entering a Star Wars type situation of war by proxy. Remember, the Clone Wars was one of the big old Star Wars episodes. We're now going to have war by drones, war by AI, and before we know it, war by robots. And
War by
which
what?
means
Robots?
robots,
What are
robots
robots?
instead of human soldiers, we're going to have robot soldiers.
Robot
Maybe not
soldiers.
tomorrow, but at some point, absolutely, I believe that. We're getting to that point where it's going to be war by remote control with no concern whatsoever for the human consequences of war. And that really frightens me.
I definitely think we will have war with robots. I think we're already having wars with robots. I don't know about robots, though. All
Take
right.
my word for it. Maybe not in my lifetime, but in yours.
All right. With that, we
What's
will.
our poll?
Oh, right. We got to check our poll. 84% say they want us to try to invite guests on the show.
How many respondents?
Like 300 plus respondents.
Okay, so it's a relatively small response at the very end of the show.
Yeah, but very robustly in
Very
favor.
robust,
Yes.
yes, finding. All right.
All right, with that, we will wrap up Lichtman Live. Don't forget the Lichtman Live post show is right after this. The link to that is in the description of the video and also pinned to the chat. All right, Dad, what are your final words to the people?
The past is prelude. If you really want to understand what's going on today, you've got to understand its historical roots. Otherwise, it's like tuning in at a football game in the fourth quarter without knowing the score, without knowing who's injured or who's playing. That's, impossible to understand the game. It's impossible to understand today's society without examining his historical roots, and we'll continue to do that every single Thursday, although we won't neglect contemporary events either.
All right, beautiful. With that, we will wrap up Lichtman Live. Say goodnight to the people, Dad.
Good night. See you Tuesday.